So first of all, thank you, Dr. Bazerman, for joining me today to have a chat about writing in general and writing in the Middle East in specific, and in particular about Turath, the initiative that I started in 2019. You're my mentor as part of the 4Cs Wikipedia Fellowship. So I'm one of 4 students who constitute the first batch of 4C's Wikipedia Graduate Fellowship. So before we begin, can you tell those who are watching this about this fellowship? What is it about? What's the goal behind it?
Case, the larger, what's behind it is the 4Cs a number of years ago formed a committee to increase representation of writing on Wikipedia, to get the field better known. It was inadequately represented. Very little of our history presented, with writing studies represented, pedagogic leaders or concepts. And what was there were under view of different fields other than our own. It started out with college composition in the US because it was 4Cs, but opened up the larger question of writing studies, both across age spans, not college composition, around the world outside of the US, and very quickly moved in both those expansions. A recent part, in the course of developing this initiative, we've been trying to enlist people in it, working at different ages and working in different countries, and familiar with different parts of the profession. So we've tried expanding outwards. Also, we sought a grant from the Wiki Foundation in order to get support from them in order to help us become more effective in both reaching participants and in having people write contributions that will be readily accepted within the, that will be acceptable within the standards of Wikipedia, which are very specific, and we might want to talk a little bit about that, and where they come from and why they are that way. Within that grant, a certain amount was designated for support of graduate students in order to engage them more in the process, and also hopefully to increase their commitment across their careers to Wikipedia and representing our field and anything else they wish to contribute to Wikipedia. And so that's where the specific grant fits in. I think that's the context for this. And as part of the grant advisors, I know you've studied Matt Vedder.
Yes.
And Matt Vedder is one of the advisors as well. He's taken on quite a number of advisees in this area. And so I volunteered to help him out, even though I don't have as much technical knowledge, anywhere near as much technical knowledge or organizational knowledge about Wikipedia as he does. He's very heavily invested in it, but I am committed to both Wikipedia and also over the years to advancing the profession and knowledge of the profession. And so I've been viewing it in that larger context. Is that enough?
Yes, thank you. It's great, thank you. So taking Turath in specific, what's the importance of digital writing initiatives like Turath, which seeks to digitize Arab literary heritage by encouraging students and composition classes to write articles about maybe long forgotten Arab authors, or maybe authors who have absolutely no presence on the internet and on Wikipedia in specific. So what do you think is the importance of digital writing initiatives like Turath that are based in specific contexts and And how do you think these initiatives contribute to writing studies in general?
So writing studies have developed differently in different regions. They have very different histories. And we've been trying to engage people from different regions, groups from Latin America, groups from Scandinavia, Northern Europe, Spain, Southern Europe. So we've been trying to enlist people from different regions. Now, it's not only because they have different scholars in it, but writing has been positioned differently, both academically and culturally in the different regions. And their different language ideologies. There's a whole lot of differences.
Yeah.
So it's very important to reach into the perspectives and the knowledge of each of the regions. So this can't be done from a center, if such a thing as a center existed. And Wikipedia itself is, again, although it had its origins in a kind of geographical region, is attempting to reach out globally and has versions in multiple languages, and is also in the process of trying to bring the knowledge from one language, Wikipedia, to another. And actually in the area of writing studies, you see this, this is part of the process of what we're doing too, to encourage translation. There's even one in Basque, where there's a famous writing scholar whose primary article is in Basque Wikipedia. And so we're trying to bring in that kind of knowledge. Now, to be more specific about, okay, so Turath, that's how you pronounced it?
Yeah,
Turath.
or Turath.
Turath. Okay.
Turath, yeah.
Certainly fits in as one of those points of view from different perspectives around the world. And now I'm going to contrast it with in the United States for a minute. In the United States, there had been a robust literary studies and representation of literary writers. And in fact, they have, or writing education has largely been beneath or within literary departments, literary programs, literary orientations. So the struggle for the field has been to distinguish itself from literary studies, which does not lack for very broad representation of the culture, although there are in recent decades, there have been very important movements within those to get at marginalized literary traditions and literary actors. But as a whole, as a field, literary studies has dominated and has obscured writing. And I won't go into that whole story, but it has been very important for writing studies to establish an independent presence.
Yeah.
In other regions, the dynamic has been different. So writing studies in some areas has been largely under language and linguistics, which have their own relationship between oral and written, and the history of linguistic theory to try and get at more authentic data, which was taken to be the oral data.
Yeah.
And so linguistics has been increasingly less about writing until recently, where you have specialized studies of writing as a special a graphylect within language, right? So that's a different story. As what little I understand about Lebanon and the Middle East, although Lebanon is a very particular version of it, is there's a mixture first of a number of linguistics and literary traditions that pervade the education, but also there has been a very close relation between journalism, literary studies, writing as a cultural formation. And that makes it a little bit independent of the colonial or European language traditions and the other educational traditions within it. So,
but not completely divorced from it, though.
right. Yeah. Yes, that's right, because the educational traditions have been tied to the let's say to the various robust social cultural formations that have sponsored the educational systems.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So it's so defining what counts as writing studies and how it be perceived is kind of an open question, and recovering the different parts of the tradition that go into people's concepts of what does it mean to write and how does one learn to be a writer, and the people who've had interesting things to say about writing and writing education, I think is something that is being formed, and there's been nothing like a canonical representation. Maybe there has been, but I don't know of anything like a canonical representation of what does it mean, what writing studies might mean. And so Taraf would be, I think, part of that process of trying to identify what is relevant to writing. And so that's how I would position it. I mean, partly it's just important to recover whatever knowledge there is about writing, and the wisdom from the area, and the great writers who have contributed to the understanding and the cultural understandings and the concepts that that have driven that. But also, this is a particular problem that emerges within the scope. And again, Wikipedia is in trying to get at global knowledge and not being the Encyclopedia Britannica or Americana, the world through the views of America, or the views of Britain. It is attempting to be really distributed in the views of everywhere in the world, which makes it heterogeneous and creates a lot of questions as to what counts of knowledge, what authenticates knowledge, where does it come from, which is a problem in, let's say, just simply a logistic problem for any encyclopedia that attempts to be distributed in its production. You see, so even going back to the old days of Encyclopedia Americana and Britannica, that was run as commercial ventures under an editorial structure. And although I know that sometimes individual articles were contracted out, those were also brought back home into the main corporate headquarters and vetted by the professional editors. So it was fairly controlled, even though you had some distribution. Wikipedia has a much more radically distributive model, which then says, well, how do we keep quality? How do we keep it just from being a platform for different advocacies and partisanship of various sorts? And I think Wikipedia, over its short life, has gone through many of the struggles where people have tried to control it for their points of view. And so it's come up with a lot of procedures for authenticating or making credible the knowledge presented. And it's still uneven, I would say.
It is.
It's still uneven, but it's so extensive. But you can't go in the same way as like when I was in high school and you go to Encyclopedia Britannica and somehow that's official knowledge. You have to read Wikipedia with something of a critical eye as to what's a solid article, what's well sourced, what's still kind of up in the air, what seems to be under, let's say, the enthusiasm of certain groups, right? So it's still an area of contention, but it's, I won't say the best because I don't know what the best is, but it's a very good attempt to try and get a much wider range of views and create much more knowledge. It's the best source by and large, but you have to read it with a critical eye. And the editorial system, which has been based entirely on voluntary labor, has to have a lot of regulations to try and maximize the credibility of such a such a wild, open space, right? Because anybody can contribute. Of course, the more you contribute and show yourself fitting, knowing the standards and knowing how to operate within that world, the more privileges you get, right? But also when I say standards, it's not like the standards are even absolutely fixed, because there's endless discussion
Yes.
of each of them as well. And that's why people like Matthew are like really into it and know it. I'm more kind of like just trying to wend my way and get things that are acceptable within it. So then on top of that, then you have the different perspectives of different fields and different points of view, which add into that contention. The general logistic problem of just domesticating all these different voices is one thing, but then on that you've got overlaid a whole lot of differences within the cultures of different fields and different regions, different belief systems into what makes for credible knowledge, right?
Yeah. We'll get to this in a second. We'll get to this in a second. I just wanted to bring back one thing about Turas. So because I've started this in 2019, and so far I've integrated it into my classroom. This is the fourth time this semester. I've noticed that students become a lot more engaged and excited about writing when it becomes a byproduct of something much larger than themselves that they're doing. When they feel that they are working on a project that has a lot of cultural significance to them, that serves a bigger purpose, they become excited about writing in a very different way. So even though the topic is maybe not necessarily related to whatever we are doing in our composition courses, they are essentially producing writing and learning how to write.
Yes.
Whenever they're writing a Wikipedia article, all the research that goes into the writing, how to avoid plagiarism, how to address the entire world, in a sense, an audience that is much larger and much bigger than their immediate audience in a classroom, whether it's the instructor or their classmates. So I find them much more engaged, and in their responses and reflective pieces, they indicate how much their view of not just writing, but their own writing has changed over the course of the semester. And this is very exciting, right?
Absolutely.
To get this kind of reaction from first-year college students in Lebanon in particular.
Well, I think everywhere there's the underlying problem of all teaching of writing is motivation. And motivation, we've tended to find that motivation comes from writing being meaningful. It can be meaningful in a lot of different ways, personally meaningful, but also meaningful for various projects, meaningful for representation, meaningful for reaching certain audiences. So Wikipedia is kind of like this on steroids, right? That it's, especially if you feel that your world is underappreciated and underrepresented, right? And especially in the face of other more dominant players in whatever sphere, right? And you want to get yourself represented. And Wikipedia allows you to speak to the whole world and allows you to speak into in a forum that is considered fairly authoritative, right? That it's got billions of users, and that this can be extremely motivating, but it also has but it also has all these restrictions and regulations and procedures that go far beyond the traditional ones of grammatical correctness or whatever kind of basics you might think of, which have to do with the particular problems of Wikipedia becoming a credible source of knowledge.
Of course.
Right, which includes things like citing and plagiarism. I think the citing part is much more interesting than the plagiarism part. Plagiarism is it's an obsession with people. It is. Well, there are many kinds of plagiarism. I won't get into that rap, but in encyclopedias or certain kinds of publications, particular. But even for Wikipedia, it's not so much that the problem isn't so much that you're stealing economic value or you're copying. That might appear in a few cases, but like pieces of music, lyrics, or something like that, poems. But it's much more in its sourcing, identifying where's the knowledge coming from, that it's a credible source.
Which is a problem for us here, I find here in Lebanon, especially because sometimes our sources depend on our oral history, right? So we are trying to circumvent this problem or this obstacle by trying to find ways to document this oral history so that we can cite it.
Right, so that's an intermediary step, and not that you want to create Potemkin villages of oral history, but having documented oral history, such as a collection of books that have been published that have collected oral histories and integrated them, right? Those can become citations then in Wikipedia. Wikipedia depends a lot on second and third order sources because they have been are viewed as being gone through more procedures and being more vetted and given more of an imprimatur. So citing those second and third order sources is more credible than you're just saying, I'm collecting this oral history for the first time. Right?
Yes,
The oral history has to be collected somewhere else. And ultimately, and we talked about this before, that I mean, it's a little bit bizarre, but you can understand the logic of it, is that one of the easiest sources to get credibility in Wikipedia is to cite another Wikipedia article. To link to another Wikipedia article, because that's assumed, well, if it's gotten to Wikipedia, it's already good. Yeah. It's all been vetted. So so that's the logic of it. It gets bizarre, but there is a logic which I think is understandable within that. Now that works against various regions, and it also works against various fields. It works against writing studies in general, because not having been, let's say, in the United States and Britain, or not having been legitimated as a field and having a whole lot of the secondary and tertiary publications that aggregate the knowledge, it is harder to find the sources that Wikipedia likes to do this. And your situation is even more difficult in not having the second and third order pre-authenticated statements of knowledge.
One of the comments that we got after one of our articles was deleted was that the book that we're citing was nowhere to be seen on the internet. That the person who yeah, well, it's sitting in our archives at the American University of Beirut. So I'm not sure you're gonna find it because the Library of Congress doesn't have a copy of it for whatever reason. But those are some of the problems that we're trying to sort out.
Right. So one solution, but it's expensive and difficult, maybe in your circumstances, that that the archives become digitized somehow. Things that are in the print world only.
Yes,
and
we are doing that.
Not within well, and then certain parts of the print world, like again, that get into the Library of Congress, right?
Yeah.
Don't exist in a sense as authenticated knowledge, right? So if your library had resources, which I'm sure it doesn't, and had the will, it could digitize, and then that would have made that one reviewer happy.
They are working on this, actually. We are, but it's a long and arduous process, and it's going to take some time.
Right. And you could also argue back. I don't know the exact form and way, but you could argue back to explain your situation. And that's what the talk pages are. And then there are forums internal. I'm sure you know this much better than I do, where you can say, no, this does not fit our circumstance. And let me explain to you why.
Yes. Yes.
What I think about it, well, there are many different issues. What I was when you first started to talk about this now, where my mind went, so literally I was thinking about was there's an interesting tension going on with the global representation of knowledge. On one side, things are becoming more available to more places. More things are becoming more available. And even in terms of language, this means with automated translation, which is getting better in 20, 30 years, unless we are all preoccupied with being flooded or something like that, it's going to get better and better. But that also means a kind of homogenization. Now that it may displace, though, for a while, there's been homogenization around major languages. That's been going on for centuries, as you know, in Lebanon. So that's on one side, although that is complex because the automated translation allows the maintenance of languages and writing in different languages, even as it translates it across, right? So it takes the burden off everybody having to learn English, French, or Arabic and writing in English, French, or Arabic, right? It changes that and also makes even those boundaries more permeable. On the other side, there are particular points of view and ways of expression that come in each of the language traditions. And they get obscured even in the machine translation. Certainly they got obscured through translation into dominant languages. So that's a tension. And it's a dilemma. So that's literally what I was first thinking about. But then another version of that same or a related tension within that is language. Our writing can both express what we think and feel from the inside out, which also involves what we've internalized in our cultures and our language experiences, cultural experiences from earliest childhood, right? So how we they are very close to the complex language experiences we've had are very close to who we feel we are and who we have become. At the same time, in language, we reach out to others. And whether those others are in our immediate group who've grown up in similar circumstances, but still have their own individual points of view, or they are, right? So this has been a problem for writers from the get-go,
Mhm.
is how do they manage that? How far are they reaching out? How much do they want to make themselves understood to whom? And how much does this do violation to they feel it does violation to who they are? Right? Every writer's had the sense that, oh, this was so much more interesting when I was just feeling it inside, but it gets so disappointing when I put it into words. That's again part of that same management between, let's say, the internal neurological formations that have us feel something, and this very thin stream of words that we manage to put on a piece of paper or in a digital document or inscribe on the walls of a building. That's a very narrow signal compared to the signals that are going on all the time in here, right? But the work is, in fact, turning whatever it is we're doing inside here into that thin stream of words, which can reach out and be intelligible to whoever we're trying to make ourselves intelligible to, right? That gets played out on an individual basis, it gets played out on a cultural basis, it gets played out on a regional basis, gets played out over time, historical basis, right? That these are the divides our words are trying to bridge, and our written words are trying to bridge. And digital makes it more complex, partly because digital brings in so many other affordances, as well as one of the written word used to be a slow technology.
Yes.
But now it can be an extremely rapid technology. Rapid both in its original language and its translation and the way you send a small message to a friend and it suddenly you're in trouble across the whole globe because right. So it's just changed. It's changed this world into which we express ourselves, at the same time as as writing has always been, it's enduring and travels, as opposed to the spoken word, which deteriorates rapidly as it moves across time and space. Can't be heard beyond a certain distance. As it gets repeated, it degrades, right, and gets reinterpreted through the minds of the various intermediaries.
Yes.
He said what?
Yes, exactly.
No, he didn't say it that way.
Dr. Bazerman, in a sense, we are, and when I say we, I'm talking about us here in Lebanon, and the Arab world, the Middle East. In essence, we're using the tools of the West to write about ourselves, in a way, right? We are navigating certain territories that do not lend themselves to us and our contexts, but we're bending them to the best of our abilities to place our mark on the digital map of the world. A map that was not composed by us. It was composed by the West, and we have to negotiate our way into what happened, for example, when I was trying to secure a space or a place for my students with Wikipedia education that has no institutions outside the US participating in this program. So we are the first outside of North America.
Really?
Yes.
I thought Wikipedia was a little bit further along that path of globalizing.
Wikipedia education is still a little bit in its taking baby steps and getting out there. So when I first reached out to them, they said, well, we're not sure, we're only working with American institutions. And I said, we are an American institution. So they took a week to look us up, and then they came back and they said, well, welcome to Wikipedia education. You're the first outside of North America. I mean, when they say
so your entry ticket was that you, not just the name AUB, but was that you're accredited by an American accrediting body?
Of course,
right?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, that's your ticket, because no, there are a lot of very prestigious universities around the world, very high quality universities, but they're accredited through different systems. Or they legitimated through different systems. So no French university is part of, no British university?
As far to my knowledge, I don't know if it changed this semester, but to my knowledge, we are the first. So
that is
it took a lot to access this platform in a sense, and especially because the purpose of Wikipedia education is to bring together the classroom and Wikipedia, to train editors, but to use Wikipedia in the classroom, which I think is very important in helping Wikipedia have a far reach. But then it's still very much contained, right? So
I'm just thinking, I'm trying to process this. Now, universities or institutions of higher education or secondary education, because I don't see why they shouldn't be part of Wikipedia and produce, are differently organized with different ideologies. And I think part of that, and I was first thinking, and then I'm saying no, but I'll put it out there. American education tends to have general education within it, and it also has versions of freshman composition, writing instruction, which is also part of that general education, whereas most other systems assume you already can write if you've gotten to the universities, partly because they are still working on the exclusionary model, right? You just take the top. But also, well, for whatever reasons, and people enter directly into their major, and there's usually, or their career, or whatever you call it, and they don't have the luxury of extra credits to be able to work on various skills, nor to pay attention to anything which isn't immediately relevant to their career or to their field. So that may be one of the reasons it's not happening. On the other hand, I think there are British and French doctors, for example, who would be part of WikiMed, right? Who are contributing to our global knowledge. But there's no education. I guess there wouldn't be an educational program that would prepare their professionals to contribute to that.
Yeah, do you mean literacy skills?
Yeah, how do you write a Wikipedia article? How do you write a Wikipedia article if you're a French doctor and you have an important finding? It's not part of the educational system to prepare people to do that.
To my knowledge, USG, which is Université Saint-Joseph in Lebanon, which is a French university, has 6 levels of English courses. I think this is very interesting that they force them to learn or study English, even though it's a French university, and they take courses in French and then Arabic, but they teach them English, especially for sciences. And having just completed my dissertation on the literacy practices and publishing practices of multilingual science researchers, I had a chance to interview many professors at USG, and they really rely on English, of course, because it's the lingua franca of science, right?
Right.
So it's a very interesting topic.
It's interesting, but I also suspect that they wouldn't find much place for Wikipedia within their English education because they're taking a linguist. Okay, so much of writing in much of the world is viewed as one of the 4 skills of language studies, and the dominating discipline is applied linguistics. And so there's a linguistic orientation to language courses. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, of course.
But it's not composition, which is like, how do you make a good statement?
Yes,
Right?
you're
It's
right.
just
You're
different logic. And again, so I could see why there's a mismatch there.
You're right, because they do teach mechanics or English grammar as a separate course, which is very interesting because they think that this helps you write better.
Right. Well, and it's part of it. It's the tools. Yeah, we work with words, and the more conversant you are with words, right? Bricklayers need to learn about bricks and mortar, right? We need to learn about words, but and what holds words together, syntax. But yeah, it's composition has this different logic, which is closer to thinking and expression, and then motivating projects.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the standards that we feel that we're following here as we're composing, right, across the different writing platforms, especially the digital, and how these afford us self-expression in a sense, or like, so when we're writing a Wikipedia article, we have to follow the standards of Wikipedia. So we're constantly being reminded that we should adhere to specific standards that were not necessarily put by us. And the reason I say this is because I wanted to ask about something that is a little bit different from what we've been talking about. One particular example that keeps coming to my mind is the resume that every employable human being writes and rewrites their entire work life. Do you have anything to say about that in particular?
Well, this is relevant to the resume, is that there is no standard resume. That the best, that it's all tends to be local, although sometimes it's codified, that these are the instructions, fill out this form. This is the exact way you need to list each item, right? But often it's a little bit more freer form, but it's within the judgment and evaluation of the readers. So as with genre, I don't think there are any absolutes. It's always a matter of historical evolution within groups of people as to what is expected and what is effective. So in terms of writing a resume, the best thing is, of course, is to speak to people who are evaluators, who read them and what works, pick out good examples for your company, in your corporate culture, right? For your line of work, for different job categories. Well, what's important and what stands out to you? Now, there may be certain things like you don't want to have smudges on the paper. You don't want to have typos, right? Because they are general characteristics of somebody who's educated and careful, right? Or they show certain qualities that employers will use to evaluate, right? So if you don't have those evaluators, though, at hand to tell you these things, you need to think yourself into the logic of those organizations.
I'm so sorry, my internet connection is breaking up. Typical of Lebanon, and when everybody joins the internet, it starts slowing down. It's Friday night. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bazerman, for joining me tonight and for giving me so much of your time. 4C is Wikipedia related, and this is I'm very happy to be part of this project, to be honest.
Delighted that you and your students are all contributing to this and helping share knowledge, because as people say, if it's not on Wikipedia, it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, exactly.
Unfortunately, that's, yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good one. Bye.